Unfortunately, my camera is not compatible with Discord for some reason, so you won't get of the light performance visually, so you will need to settle with the beautiful light set that I made for you. But as said, the topic today is going to be about narrative design, and especially about narrative design from day one in your game projects, and especially what it's like to create meaning to the games that we make. So it's a good idea to start with the question of what does narrative designer do? And I think all of us can conjure up some ideas about it, but basically narrative design does a lot of stuff in game projects. This is something I found from LinkedIn, which describes perfectly of the area of work that is involved inside narrative design. So it is not only about writing, but it can be a lot about systems design, it can be about directing actors, it can be about thinking voices, etc., etc. So when you're thinking about narrative design, it's good to remember that it involves all sorts of different things. And something about my background, so why am I here today talking in the first place? So as said, I'm a freelancer. I've been a freelancer already for over 10 years at this point. And my company Mysteri does different consulting to different companies. We are specialized in immersive executions, which means that we do real life games. We originally started with escape room games, and we had locations in 6 different cities at its best all around Finland. And then when we made business exit around 2019, that's when I started to do digital game studies as well, and I've gradually worked in my portfolio with digital game projects as well. So during this 10 years, besides making our own games, we've been doing a lot of client work, and that's the row below. So I've had the chance to work with multiple different clients with various different game projects. And for these 10 years, I've been calling myself game designer as an overall title, but if everything boils down to narrative design eventually, because my game design tends to grow from the meaning first, and that's why even though I tend to design the actual whole structure of the game in some projects only by myself, it is in digital game words, I would call it narrative design. And especially with Supercell project and the project with Netflix was especially doing narrative design consulting for their cases. And shortly about educated background, even though I know it's not that important in games, but maybe it gives you some context to the way I think about design overall, is that I come from really hands-on background. So I've done the basic lukio, but I also went to do vocational school and woodwork renovation. But then I did tourism studies. So basically, I'm Bachelor of Hospitality Management, and I was Bachelor of Hospitality Management when I started my career designing escape rooms. So basically, I didn't have any type of background in game making. I was avid player when I was young, but that was about it. So when I first started making my game project, it was just thinking, how could this be the best way possible? And then it took me almost 5 years doing games after I figured that, hey, maybe I could get an actual degree. And that's when I applied to do my master's at Aalto University. So I did the game design and productions master over there, gained some bit more design experience, different design tools, etc. And then after that, I was drafted for a short while to do my PhD work in Aalto School of Science, where I investigated especially the interpretive nature of games and how do you design mystery games in particular. But even though that was academic and game studies related, my view on the topic was always hands-on, because I was especially interested on the practicality of how designers work and what are the applicable tools that designers could use with their work. So that goes back to my years in vocational school, and always back to the question, what type of tools am I able to use as a designer? And especially in narrative design, those studies involved a lot with the topic of the lecture, because my work concentrated on meaning making in particular. So how do we create meaning especially in those cases when we are not explicitly told that this is something you should see in the game, but when you are invited to fill in the blanks rather than being explained that this is something you should understand. So that's the background, and because I do have this experience with Aalto, I have a little bit of theory involved here as well. So the intention of this lecture is to be both professional, so coming from game industry background, but as well give you some theory base. It might be new, it might be old, but let's see. And also give you some hands-on tools, which you would be able to use in your own projects. So a tiny recap of my life story. This is not going to take 35 years, but just to give you the context that when I was a small girl, there wasn't a profession called game designer in my world. So I'm pretty sure that in Ähtäri, where I came from, that's a town of 6,000 people nowadays. I'm pretty sure that there wasn't many people who knew that game design was a profession. So it actually took me 25 years to realize like, hey, actually someone could make a living out of this. So at 25, we founded our company Mystery. And basically what led to that was playing a game, obviously. And in 2015, escape room games had just started to land in Finland, but there weren't that many yet of them yet. So we didn't play our first game in Finland because we didn't know they existed, but this was in Tallinn. And this is literally the game literally a photo from the first game we ever played. And it was January, it was cold and freezing, and we wanted to do something fun with my boyfriend. And we ended up playing an escape room game. And it was exhilarating experience. We had so much fun with a completely new and surprising way that we were in complete awe mode when we came out of the room. And then after that moment, it took us about 3 weeks to found a company, found a first location, start building our game. And then our first game happened, opened to the players 2 months after that. So that was 2015. But the why I'm mentioning this here is that originally I became escape room designer because I played a game which lacked meaning, which lacked narrative. Because even though the game was exhilarating, it was fun, it was super, super, super interesting to play, I just asked myself after the game, what was all this about? Why was I in a room? Like, what was the who lived there? What was the point? And basically, my main motivation to build an escape room game was that tiny frustration of me wanting to play a better story. So that's why the motivation and the question I started to ask for myself was that why would there be locks in a person's room? And that was the starting point for our first game, Siiri's Room, Siirin Huone. And there my intention was to find a reason, find a solid reason, why would this person have locks in their room? And then eventually, making escape rooms became about exploring those different questions that you have within the genre. And nowadays, when I'm asked if I think that escape rooms are a good narrative medium, I say that they are adequate, but they are not perfect, because especially in a market size of Finland, it is really hard to make these high-end luxury escape room products where you would be able to answer all the different questions that are bothering your mind and would make narratively sense. So it was sort of my way to start hack into the problem by answering one question at a time. And sometimes we succeeded with themes and sometimes we didn't. So basically, that was the starting point for my career. And after making a bunch of those escape room games, I started to make different client projects as well. For example, for Linnanmäki, we did an outdoors game which was meant to be played with even 150 people. So the different games became varied, but I think it always boiled down to the question of what is the meaning of this game, and finding reasons for the players to understand why they are playing the game in the first place. And I think that is essentially narrative design. It is trying to find that meaning. So the following topic, which would be hopefully about 30 minutes, and then some questions after that. Let's see. I've never done this lecture, so it might go below that time or over that time. But we'll explore 3 topics. So, first of all, why narrative should be involved early. Secondly, why narrative is like a clue in your game project. And thirdly, the practical tips. Is it a story or a fantasy that you are making in your game? So a spoiler alert as well, because I think it's nice to tell in advance that some games will be discussed, and it is more fruitful to delve into the game more with context and with specific stuff than just trying to be too vague about it. So if you haven't played one of these games but you want to play, then when you see their picture, then just know that I will probably spoil something accidentally, even though I don't want to do it, but you got my drift probably. But going to the first topic. So why narrative should be involved early in your game project? I'm going to show you a brief video, so if I can get a shout out if the voice isn't audible, then
mechanics convey meanings.
Because I won't be able to hear it, but it should
In
work.
Eco, you are playing a child, cast into obscurity for being born with horns, and it uses mechanics to convey a specific sequence of meanings. You are a disempowered kid, so you are hard to control. When you stumble across the Princess Yorda, the isolated context makes you appreciate her companionship in this harsh world. Forcing us to hold down a button to guide her around simulates intimacy, and stripping away a traditional health bar and tying our well-being to hers is an ingenious way to make us act selfless. Eco was somewhat revolutionary when it came out, inspiring games as varied as Dark Souls to Prince of Persia, but what it showed clearer than most was how you could use interactivity to convey specific meanings, sometimes deliberately at the expense of player agency. Let's broaden the scope here. Journey is a game that is meant to parallel the hero's journey of Joseph Campbell fame, and it uses mechanics to convey these themes. Getting the scarf at the beginning of the game is a power-up in some sense, but here it is meant to emulate that step in the hero's journey where you receive the boon to face your adventure. A slow, plodding pace in the early sections gives way to the free-flowing cadence of the sand-surfing section, emulating the road of trials and joy, which is then quickly followed by fear in the belly of the whale as you avoid menacing enemies, then adversity on your way to the top of the mountain as your movement is severely restricted. Finally, you are given the ability to fly, and this relatively mobile sensation replicates resurrection, transcendence, and apotheosis as you journey to the peak. Additionally, when you meet players through the game, your abilities improve, suggesting that to be around others is in fact enlivening and transformative. And this all culminates in a conclusion, spoiler alert, where you return to the beginning of your journey, ready to pass your received wisdom to a new generation. Eco and Journey are the most cited examples when it comes to meaningful mechanics, because they were built around their themes. Fumito Ueda leverages a design philosophy called design by subtraction, where he removes anything that doesn't reinforce the core theme. That game company starts with a theme and then leverages the tools of interactivity to convey that message. The clarity of how intimacy, joy, fear, love, vulnerability, hardship, and resurrection are conveyed makes these games great examples. But we have an entire medium full of games that have used mechanics in different ways to convey different meanings. It can be very difficult to explain how games convey specific metaphors, but I feel we need to start building a library of these meaningful mechanics if we want to push the medium forward.
So here's a short section of this wonderful video about meaningful mechanics, which I super recommend watching. It has a lot of good thoughts about this topic. But as you probably noticed, it involved a lot about mechanics. And I think that's where narrative stems from at its best. So you can briefly try to think, when was the last time when you encountered a mechanic which told a story? I'm sure you can come up with a bunch of good examples from games you've played. But as well, you can think, when was the last time when you encountered a mechanic which conveyed a meaning? And I think meanings and stories can be thought of in tandem because they are so intertwined in each other. So here I have another example. The voice is not audible in this one, but this is a short game poem by Jordan Magnusson. And here I couldn't find another example, so here is some dude playing the game. But basically, when you're playing this game, it is really super stripped down game, so you don't have much control. You have VAST in your VASD to control the square, but that's just basically it. And here, when the player is playing the game, the square, who is apparently the playable character, when they enter through the barbed fire, even though you are pressing the key exactly at the same amount of pressure as previously, you can clearly feel how the movement gets more restricted and more slow. Then the same happens again. You get the feedback from the game that what you are doing is actually really painful. And then you get the feedback from the visuals that you are starting to bleed more. So when you are actually playing it, personally, it does feel like I'm being hurt when I'm going through the fence. So I recommend checking it out if these types of games are your thing. But Jordan Magnuson does a lot of work with game poems, especially, which means that his goal is not to make so much commercial products, but more to investigate what can different mechanics say about the play itself. So there you are suddenly being killed, and the main topic of the game is drawn towards the Freedom Bridge, which is the passing between North and South Korea. So there we definitely have a meaningful mechanic, which in essence, by playing it, gives you a meaning just through a mechanic without conveying so much with different aesthetics around it. But you might ask, why am I talking mechanics if you came to narrative design lecture? So one reason is that in studies, in game studies, we talk quite a lot about MDA model. And I know that this might be a groan for some people. This might be super boring topic because at least while I was studying in Aalto, I heard about MDA model so many times. But in case you are not familiar with MDA framework, it is probably the most famous game design framework there is in the world because it is so simple. It is not without its flaws, but it manages to depict almost any type of game that is out there. So basically, MDA stands for mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. And games are designed from mechanics up. And player encounters the game through aesthetics. And aesthetics can mean visual, audio, everything related to aesthetics. And then what happens in between is the dynamics. And as game designers, we are not able to design the dynamics because players always interact with our games in different ways. But the one thing we are able to control is the mechanics. And that's why probably when you have started your game projects, you have started with the mechanics, because we know that a good game loop starts from understanding mechanics, understanding what you are able to do with your team, and building up from that mechanics. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is that if you start from the mechanics, then if you would add the meaning only after you have made your game, as in like you have finished game and then you figure out like, hey, we need narrative, we don't know what this is about, it will feel like an afterthought. It will feel like a wrapper. So that's why if you start thinking about the meaning already when you're working on the mechanics, then you have a higher chance in succeeding, because narrative is so much involved and narrative is so entwined inside the game process. And like I said in the beginning, at its best, the mechanics are already meaningful and they are telling something about the game, even without the aesthetics. And that's when the player are able to feel from ground up the whole experience of the game and not only the wrapper. So that's why narrative thinking belongs to the start. We can think as a thought exercise, we can think what common mechanics might mean. I mean, this isn't a perfect list and some of these things are pretty dumb, but it's a good exercise to try to think what could the most known mechanics mean in your context. And even though you wouldn't explicitly make something out of it, it's a good exercise that can help with different areas of game making. For example, art. If you're thinking that jumping in your game might be an indication about growing, then that might actually be a really good keyword for an artist who are trying to work on the animation of your game. If you're making a ball game, for example, then if you're thinking about the movement, then you might think that player moving this character like this means that the balls are able to move forward, and that might be meaningful for the characters. So just like going into these thought processes early on, not just they will open up the position, the space of thinking when you're working in your game in a long run. And then you will, as you gather these ideas and these thoughts, you will start to notice which ones are the ones that you feel are good and make sense in the context of your game. I'm going to show a few case examples about three different games where we can think about the mechanics. So you might know Papers, Please. So in Papers, Please, you are a border official whose job it is to decide if a person gets an entry to your country. So you deny and you pass the applicants at the border. And it's a super gritty game, so it lacks joy, but it's supposed to be brutal in a way. So because you're balancing with your livelihood, the game portrays quite well that you have a family at home. You're supposed to make ends meet, but at the same time you're playing with human lives at the border, and you encounter pretty severe situations where the applicant's life depends on your decision. So basically here, I'd say that the mechanic of you deciding if the person gets the pass or not, it's about morality. It's about what it's being human. And then another example, Brothers, Tale of Two Sons, from a Swedish company Hazelart. They apparently now made a remake, so now it looks way more better than I played it. But in this game, you are playing as two characters. So you are playing as a big brother and a little brother. And the main crux of the whole game is that it's played with one controller. So you can apparently play it by yourself. We played it with my husband with the one controller. It was quite hard, but quite fun. But here, since the whole mechanic is to think that you are doing it on that one controller, and it's quite hard. Here the point is connection. The mechanics are there to enforce the bond between the brothers. And here comes the spoiler, so cover your ears if you don't want to hear it, but especially at the end of the game when the other brother dies, and then you suddenly lose whole another part of the controller, you lose another part of interacting with the world, then you definitely feel loss, and it feels meaningful. Especially, it felt meaningful that you had the connection, because when it is taken away from you, then it does feel super, super bad. Then third example, Outer Wilds, my special favorite. In Outer Wilds, you are playing inside a small galaxy. You are a space ranger whose job is to investigate the outskirts of your tiny galaxy. And you encounter different hazards. You try to find other lost explorers, and the world is super savage. So in a sense, it's a cozy game full of hope. So it's about exploration and wonder. I think the mechanics depict that really well. But as well, it's about endurance and about being in this hard and perilous world, because you die all the time. And that's the main point of the game, is it's to understand that in this universe there are a lot of dangers, but you always start the day anew. So it's about perseverance as well. I'm sorry, I'm getting some cough. Just a moment. But here comes the point of why narrative should start early. So it's because meaning isn't something you patch in later. I mean, you can do it, but it takes a lot of work and it can go quite wrong. If you execute narrative too late, you might end up doing retrofit writing. You might do painful exposition. then it's super visible to your players that you haven't given this thought early enough. And it might lead to emotional disconnect, because then you might feel that the game story is telling you something that the game isn't conveying otherwise. So here is a fancy word you can use to impress your friends: ludonarrative dissonance, which basically means a clash between video game storytelling and its gameplay mechanics, where the actions the player takes in the game contradict the narrative the game tries to tell. And one famous example of this is Uncharted series. So Uncharted, on the other hand, tries to paint the main protagonist, Nathan Drake, as this super amiable, friendly, and lovable, the best boyfriend you could possibly have kind of dude. Super fun, super cute, and everything. But then on the other hand, he does kill a lot of people. And that's the main mechanic, basically. You climb and you kill people. So how come this amiable guy is just so cold-bloodedly going around and shooting people in the head? So that's ludonarrative dissonance, and tone dissonance especially. But then if we think of another example, then we have Florence.
Conflict in counterintuitive ways is something the game Florence did recently. It's a game about a girl falling in love with a guy, but it uses a pastiche of light interactive elements to reinforce specific emotions. On your first date, the conversation between the two is represented by simple matching puzzles, but as the date goes on, the puzzles become easier, telling us that they are coming together. In another part of the game, when your bow is moving in, you have to figure out which of your things you want to get rid of, and the indecision implicit in figuring out what to get rid of simulates the actual compromises one needs to make when you are in a relationship. I don't want to spoil any more, and the game is only 30 minutes long, so go play it, but it uses devices like these through the game to convey a variety of emotions.
So there you could see really well thought of mechanics. When I played this game for the first time, I was simply blown away how thoughtfully it was constructed, and especially the point about the speech bubbles. So essentially, there is a mechanic where you are meeting a person for the first time, and let's see if I can
Conflict in
stop it
counterintuitive ways is something
there.
the game
This one.
telling us that they are coming.
Yes. So when you are meeting the person for the first time,
On your
it
first
is
date, the conversation
kind of hard to find the right words. It feels like you need to parse your thoughts to make the conversation flow. But
between the
then,
two is represented by simple matching puzzles.
as it
But as the date
continues,
goes on, the puzzles become easier.
you notice that you don't have to think that much. It becomes easier to communicate with the person. And when I played this, I had the epiphany of this is exactly what it feels like. So here, the makers were able to nail down the actual feeling that this event would have in the real life scenario. So here, the tone aligned. Here, the game mechanic was telling the same story as the story itself and as the tone overall. So, benefits of early narrative design. I hope we agree that narrative design, if it started early enough, it anchors the tone and the mechanics together. It builds shared vocabulary. It's so much easier to work with your friends on the game when you have decided that this item will be called that. And if you are able to do that early on rather than later, then it makes everything easier, just naming the assets and everything. It's easier that way. It also prevents contradictions because then you might not have so many situations where different disciplines have started to go to wrong directions. And it creates unified vision for the whole project. So that concludes the section 1. I have to cough more because I'm not used to talking so much. I'm usually by myself working at the office, so this is a lot of talking for me. I hope I survive. So moving on to the section 2. So why narrative design is like a glue and how it supports the entire game structure. So what I've only learned just lately is that when I went into digital games, I somehow had this beautiful, beautiful idea that I'm going to go to digital games to tell my stories. And it took some learning to realize that it's in fact not the way, not the place to tell the stories. I mean, you can write a book, and that's an easier way for you to tell stories. But rather, narrative is a support role in game projects. So essentially, narrative designers are there to help each disciplines to align around the why, the meaning of the game. And because narrative designers do that, we are the connective tissue of the meaning, which make us the glue in the projects, because we always drive people back to the question of why this game is doing this way. What are we trying to tell? Why is this world like this? Why is this character acting like this? And when someone is answering those questions, it can be a big relief to the other disciplines because it saves their thinking time as well. They are able to go to the narrative designer and ask, why is this character looking like this? Where are they coming from? What is their day like? How should I add to their personality, etc., etc. And especially one thing that I want to stress is that narrative design isn't there to add extra work, but it's there to support. And because it's there to support, it gives meaning and focus to everyone's work. So remember that your friendly neighborhood narrative designer is there to help you. And narrative design is a lot of things, like I said in the beginning. Narrative design connects different disciplines, translates a story and the intent into holistic design language. That's another favorite word of a narrative designer, being holistic. Narrative design condenses. They condense the meaning and emotional resonance of the mechanics. Sometimes they might do it even after the game is on full speed. The game project is in full speed. So that's what I did in one of my projects. I was brought to the game project when it had been on its way already for several months. And they had some thoughts about the narrative, what this might be about, but since there wasn't a dedicated person to take ownership of the narrative at that point, when I came in, my first job was to understand what the team members thought was the narrative behind everything. And when I had talked with all the discipline owners, it was my job to condense their shared understanding of the meaning into a coherent whole. And narrative design is also a facilitator, and that means that it's our job to keep the disciplines aligned around the game's why and gently guide them back to the established why. And also, we are custodians of fantasy, and we ensure that every element supports the player's imagined role. And this slide is here. Thank you, Emmi, from the past, to breathe, because there was a lot of text in the previous one. And there will be a lot of text in the next one as well. I'm sorry about that. So what is narrative design like in a big team? So when I'm going to give you brief examples of what type of work I'm doing with different disciplines. So when it comes to design, for example, if it's about UX design, for example, I might be asked, what is this menu about? Where is this menu stationed? Is this menu in the real world? And how are we transitioning between this and this? How does this menu feel like? Or if it's about actual game design, then it might be, how are we gonna portray the winner in this game? Where is the scoreboard gonna be placed? Does it have some narrative meaning that there is a scoreboard in this universe? Why would these characters play this type of game in the first place? Then in narrative design, I worked quite a lot with art, and narrative and art go hand in hand quite often because so many of the things that you visually see in a game have somehow narrative impact. So it's much about shaping the tone of the art style. It's talking a lot about the characters. Character design is another big topic. If you have any type of character that has a personality, then narrative designer is the person to go to. Then there's also the environmental storytelling, there's UI and cutscenes and all the stuff. Then, of course, with audio, narrative design matches the tone, the emotional trajectory and the pacing of the game. With programming, it's about implementing the systems that narrative design needs. For example, will there be a need for subtitles in the game? Will there be voiceover that needs to take place? And stuff like that. And with production, it's about preparing pitch documents and design documents for external collaborators. For example, if art is being outsourced, then there needs to be some narrative thought behind it telling why does the game look like this. It might be about marketing documents. And overall, in production, it's about championing the story, reminding everyone that, hey, remember that narrative point of view that this is XYZ. And basically, in a big team, being the narrative discipline owner means that you are there to speak for the fantasy or the story when there is a need. So basically, if there's something connected to narrative elements of the game, you should be there on the spot talking about it and championing the narrative. And its best narrative design is the connecting glue. So as said before, it's there to support, it's there to combine, it's there to condense, and it's there to communicate between disciplines. Because not in all cases there isn't maybe a dedicated person who goes to the aesthetic experience as much as the narrative designer does, because that again ties back to the holistic elements of the game. So by nature, narrative designers are in a good spot to convey different topics to the different disciplines through answering the question of why we are making the stuff the way we are making. But we are getting closer to the section 3, so what if you cannot afford a narrative designer, which might be the case in your projects, as far as I've understood, that you are not yet Supercell game makers. So what if you can't afford a narrative designer? And there, my simple solution is to try to think if you are making a story or a fantasy. And I think it's so much cheaper to aim for a fantasy. And if you have more resources or you have more passion, then you can aim for a story. So you don't need a big team or a lot of text to make narrative happen. Because we usually tend to think that, oh, if we have a narrative experience, then we will need 5 million cutscenes and 5 different voice actors telling about their 30 years of living on a planet X. But you don't need that. If you think through player fantasy, it's about thinking through the peak emotional experience that you can have in your game, that the player can experience. And next up, I'm gonna give you 3 tools which can be used in small teams and which I've used in big teams as well. And I find these tools really useful, especially at the start of the journey that you have in your game, because even though you wouldn't end up making a narrative piece, then with these tools, you will be able to hopefully make a holistic piece, because I think that's something all of us want from our games. We want our games to make sense. We want the players to feel like the games we are making are actually compact wholes. So they are not arbitrary, they are not badly thought of. We want them to think that there went a lot of love and hard work and thought into the products we are making. So that's why thinking about this, like giving this even a smallest think, might help you making your game overall more meaningful. And I'm gonna share you the slides deck, by the way, so you don't have to do this like at the moment. And for the sake of the questions, I think I'm just gonna babble these through, and you don't need to like stop thinking about them now, but you can dig the slide set later out and then check it out. But the first exercise is defining the player fantasy. So in this player fantasy, you choose the game and then you aim to define this sentence here. So you fill the blanks from player's point of view. In this game, I got to bleep, which is wonderful because bleep. I get to bleep by bleep. So for example, I try to fill this on the go for the Outer Wilds. In this space, I got to explore space, which is wonderful because it arouses my curiosity. I get to spend time in places I've never been to or could go by flying my spaceship. So that's one way to put it, and you can make multiple of these. You don't need to settle in the first one, but eventually it might be good that you have one really well condensed version. And with all of these tools that I give you here, it's good to remember that the more you hone and polish these, the better it gets. So it's not supposed to be that you make one of these exercises in the beginning and then it's cast in stone and you are not able to ever change it. But in some cases, it's really good and intentional decision to go back to the exercises you made in the beginning of your project and realize like, hey, we feel like the whole team has shifted their view on the topic. Should we change this as well? And then by making these kinds of intentional decisions and then documenting these, it's so much easier to get back to the decisions when you are finding yourself contradicted about a topic or a different element of if a feature should be added, etc., etc. So it's always easy to refer back to the why that you have decided together. Then another exercise is called tone matching. So here I recommend that you have the stakeholder team or at least someone from art, from design and code, just to make it balanced. And here you should find alignment to these questions, and especially the first one. So which 3 adjectives describe the entirety of our game, and especially adjectives? So for example, for Florence, I'd say that the adjectives could be dreamy, lovable and delightful. And then for Papers, Please, it's gritty, brutal and totalitarian. And Outer Wilds, I'd call it wondrous, curious and arduous. So tone matching is especially good with everything you do with your game experience, because I don't honestly care if your game wants to be unfair. It can be unfair if that's the tone you're aiming for, but just make sure that you're being consistent with the unfairness, because then the player will also understand that you are not being unfair just because you have designed it badly, but you are being unfair because that's the whole tone of the game. And by having a clear tone, you have better chances to understand the narrative as well if you decide to move to the direction of making a whole story. And then the third one is working through metaphors. This is a nice exercise to do anyway, even though you wouldn't have a game project. I think it's fruitful for anyone who designs games to think, what are the 3 most important mechanics in this game? You can pick any game on the market. And then you can try to think why they are meaningful and especially what they tell about the world and the player in it. But we're ending the end of the lecture, so I'm gonna recap the key takeaways. So first one is that start narrative design early as possible to get it good. Then remember that narrative is there to support and not burden your work. It's there to connect the disciplines behind the why, and that small teams can always afford to think about the player fantasy. And narrative is not about telling stories, it's about creating meaningful experiences. So, thank you.